The root word of discipline is discerna, which is a Latin word, which means disciple, to learn and to teach. So what are we modeling? And that's good discipleship. And what are we teaching in our processes? And I believe that we teach with consequences. Like there has to be consequences that takes place, logical consequences and natural consequences. Punitive consequences is something where you're disconnecting the consequence to the behavior. So true restorative practices with discipline as a teaching tool utilizes consequences as a teaching aspect, but doesn't remove the behavior from the consequence, which punitive does. So if a kid gets into, let's say, a fight into the school, yes, there may be a suspension needed, and I believe in suspensions. I think that sometimes they're utilized for a way to keep the environment safe, and that's something that we need in education. But what do we do after that suspension? Because even before the podcast, we talked about, George, the differentiation of even the consequences in homes, right? Like one family may give this type of consequence, this family may give this consequence, and we don't have control over those things. What we have control over is the school culture and the environment. So when that student returns from a suspension, are they doing steps towards making things right with who they impacted? Are they learning a skill gap? What I did at my high school, after a student had their second fight, they would go with our counselors for every Tuesday and Thursday for 3 months in a row. They'd grab their lunch, they would meet with the counselors and work in a small group on aggression replacement training, which is pretty much anger management. So for 3 months, they would work Tuesday and Thursday with their lunch to build that skill up. And that's a good logical consequence. It wasn't just a suspension, now you're done. It's a suspension, and now let's see if there's a skill gap. Let's reinforce that skill gap, and let's repair any harm that took place at the same time.
Yeah, and like the idea of like just like here's this action, here's this consequence is something that I've always struggled with. And I would always give this analogy to my staff. I'd say, like, think about you're speeding, right? And a cop pulls you over and says, "Do you know why I pulled you over?" "Well, because I'm speeding." And then all of a sudden the cop writes you a ticket for speeding and like not having conversation with you or anything, and then gives you the ticket. And 9 times out of 10, what does the person think? Stupid cop. Yeah. Right? Like they're mad at the cop for them doing the wrong thing, because it's just like, here's what you did, here's the issue. And so is there, like, I understand that, and I'm not like, that's not something that I'm like, I get that, but that's how I didn't want to be, is that you want the person that's actually making the action, having issue. And, something I really did that was simple. And it was like super easy for me when I would do this with students. When something would go wrong, I would just ask the question, why are you here today? Right? And I would just ask that question, and I would sit and wait. And a lot of times the reason I would ask that question is I would say, like, because this is the thing with what happens in schools. A lot of times, like, I would have some information from a teacher, but the kid wouldn't know what I knew. So sometimes they would tell me way more stuff. I'm like, oh my God, that's like way worse than what we knew, right? Mm-hmm. And so they would tell, and I would sit and wait. Like, I would be patient with it. And the first thing I didn't want to do is say, well, I heard you did this and this and this and this, because their focus is more on how I'm a jerk, how they don't like me, as opposed to like listening to themselves. And so they would go through that process. And then after they would do this, I would say, okay, what would you do if you were me? And you're trying to get them, and you're trying to get them to figure out the pathway forward for themselves. And this is like, most teachers know this. A lot of kids are way harder on themselves than the teacher would actually be. And I don't know, like, Valerie, did you see that, kind of in your role as an administrator? Like, how did you kind of use some of these practices in the work that you did before you took over as director of partnerships?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I think, one of the things as a teacher, I always prided myself in building relationships with kids and building that community in the classroom so students felt safe and students were able to, share and discuss. Another thing was, again, in building the relationships with the students and understanding where they were coming from, it was always about teaching them and not just punishing them. Like you said, there's a process. And I know that in the beginning, and I'm sure a lot of new teachers out there can agree, you're trying to fix the problem. And then it becomes more about you and less about them. And so I think when you give them the time to process what's actually happened, and, Dr. Belinda George gave me this advice. She said, try and asking a student, do you want to make things better or do you want to make things worse? And when I began asking that question to students, they always chose that they wanted to make things better. And the thing was it offered them the time to process what happened. And they were also able to say, hey, she's not just going to punish me. She's going to figure out what is wrong and then we're going to be able to solve that together versus, go to ISS. I don't want to hear it. This is what I saw. This is what I heard, and move on. And I think that sometimes we don't give ourselves enough time to do that. We don't give ourselves as teachers. We don't give ourselves as administrators because we have so much going on. But we definitely get that time back later if we continue to build relationships and go along with handling situations, challenging situations, such like that.
Well, I got to ask you this because this is like a side conversation. Dr. Belinda George, I swear that is Dr. Belinda George, was she's doing like Facebook readings or something like that?
Yes.
Yeah, I actually wrote about her, and I think in one of my books.
Really? Yeah, she does Tucked In Tuesdays.